For 2 years, they called her cursed. They let her daughter starve. They whispered that God himself had struck down her husband for his sins. But Margaret Holloway knew the truth was far more terrifying than any curse. Her husband had been murdered, and the killer was still out there watching from the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to finish what he started. When a wounded cowboy stumbled upon her cabin seeking shelter, he brought with him something she had lost long ago: hope. But he also brought something else: his past. And it was about to collide with hers in ways neither of them could imagine. The autumn wind cut across the open plains of Wyoming territory like a blade forged in the mountains themselves. It carried the scent of pine and the promise of winter sweeping through the valley where the small town of Willow Creek huddled against the encroaching wilderness. The year was 1879, and in this remote corner of America's civilization remained a fragile thing easily broken by nature, by circumstance, or by the cruelty that sometimes lived in human hearts. On this particular October morning, the wind seemed to carry something else entirely, something that felt like judgment. Margaret Holloway stood at the edge of the wooden boardwalk that lined the main street of Willow Creek, her hand gripping tightly to the small fingers of her daughter Clara. The child pressed close against her mother's worn cotton dress, sensing the tension that radiated from every person who passed them by. At 6 years old, Clara did not fully understand why people looked at them the way they did, but she understood enough to be afraid. They had walked 7 miles from their cabin in the foothills to reach this town. 7 miles of dirt roads and rocky paths that had left blisters on Maggie's feet and exhaustion in Clara's young legs. 7 miles of hope that perhaps today would be different, that perhaps someone would finally show them kindness. That hope was about to be crushed. The general store owned by Silas Brennan stood before them like a fortress. Its weathered wooden facade and dusty windows held everything they needed to survive the coming winter: flour, salt, perhaps some dried beans if fortune smiled upon them. In the pocket of her apron, Maggie carried the last of their money, coins that she had scraped together by selling eggs from the few chickens that still survived on their property. It was not much, but it should have been enough. Should have been. Silas Brennan emerged from the doorway before Maggie could even step onto the porch. He was a thick man with a barrel chest and arms like oak branches, his face weathered by decades of frontier life. Behind him, several townspeople had gathered, drawn by some invisible signal that promised entertainment at someone else's expense. The storekeeper planted himself in the doorway, arms crossed over his chest, blocking any possibility of entry. Maggie lifted her chin despite the trembling in her hands. She had learned long ago that showing weakness only invited more cruelty. These people were like wolves. They could smell fear. "I need to purchase some supplies, Mr. Brennan." She kept her voice steady, though it cost her dearly. "Just some flour and salt. I have money." Silas Brennan looked at her the way one might look at a rat discovered in the grain storage. His lip curled with undisguised contempt. "I have told you before, Mrs. Holloway." His voice rose loud enough for everyone to hear, turning her humiliation into a public spectacle. "My store does not serve those who are cursed. You and your daughter bring bad fortune to anyone who helps you. Everyone knows this." A murmur of agreement rippled through the gathered crowd. Maggie saw heads nodding, saw the fear and suspicion in eyes that had once been neighborly. 2 years ago, these same people had attended her wedding anniversary celebration. They had eaten her food, laughed at her husband's jokes, called her friend. Now they looked at her as if she carried plague. Clara tugged at her mother's dress, her small voice barely above a whisper. "Mama, I am hungry." The words pierced Maggie's heart like arrows. She knelt down and pulled her daughter close, trying to shield her from the hostile stares that surrounded them. "Please," Maggie looked up at Silas, abandoning the last shreds of her pride. "At least for the child. Clara has done nothing wrong. She is just a little girl." Silas Brennan spat on the ground, the glob of saliva landing inches from Maggie's worn shoes. "The child of a sinner is still marked by sin. Samuel Holloway brought disaster upon this town, and he paid the price for his arrogance. You should thank the Lord that we only refused to trade with you instead of driving you out as you deserve." From somewhere in the crowd, a voice spoke up. It belonged to Vernon Mills, a rancher whose property bordered the road to Maggie's cabin. "Now see here, Silas. Perhaps we are being too harsh. The woman just wants to buy some food." Hope flickered briefly in Maggie's chest, but Silas crushed it with a single furious glare. "Shut your mouth, Vernon, unless you want to be the next one cursed." Have you forgotten what happened to Thomas Garrett when he lent this widow his wagon? The axle broke the very next day. Coincidence, I think not. Vernon Mills retreated as if he had been slapped, his face pale with superstitious terror. The brief spark of courage extinguished as quickly as it had appeared. Maggie gathered Clara into her arms and stood. The crowd parted to let her pass, though not out of respect. They simply did not want to risk touching her, as if her misfortune might be contagious. She walked away from the store with her back straight and her head held high, though inside she was crumbling. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. Not here. Not in front of her daughter. The 7 miles back to the cabin stretched before her like an eternity. Halfway home, exhaustion forced Maggie to stop and rest beneath an ancient oak tree whose branches spread wide enough to offer shelter from the autumn sun. Clara had fallen into a fitful sleep in her arms, the child's face still marked by dried tear tracks. Maggie leaned against the rough bark and allowed herself to cry. Silent tears that she had been holding back for 2 years. Tears of grief, of anger, of hopeless desperation. Tears for the husband she had lost and the life that had been stolen from them. Samuel Holloway had been the finest man she had ever known. For 10 years he had worked as the blacksmith of Willow Creek, earning a reputation for both his exceptional craftsmanship and his uncommon kindness. His hands could shape iron into anything from delicate hinges to sturdy plowshares, but it was his heart that truly set him apart. Samuel believed that every person deserved a second chance. It was more than just a philosophy for him. It was a calling. While others in the town turned away those they deemed unworthy, Samuel opened his doors. He hired former prisoners trying to rebuild their lives after serving their sentences. He employed people of color when no one else would give them work. He took in widows who had been cast aside by society and taught them trades that could support their families. The town had warned him. Over and over they had told him that his charity would bring ruin, that associating with such people would taint him and everyone around him. But Samuel had refused to listen. God does not discriminate when it comes to salvation. He would say, his voice firm with conviction. Neither will I. Then 2 years ago, Samuel had died. It had happened so quickly that Maggie still struggled to comprehend it. He had been healthy that morning, strong as the iron he shaped working at his forge, as he had done every day since she had known him. By afternoon, he had begun to shake. By evening, he was delirious with fever, unable to recognize his own wife and daughter. Before dawn the next day, he was gone. The town doctor had called it brain fever, a mysterious illness that struck without warning and killed without mercy. There was nothing anyone could have done, he had assured her. These things simply happen sometimes. But the town had seen it differently. To them, Samuel's death was divine punishment, proof that his charity toward the undeserving had been a sin in the eyes of the Lord. They pointed to his sudden demise as evidence of a curse, and that curse they decided now extended to his widow and child. The teche had begun the day after the funeral. Shops refused to serve her. Neighbors who had once been friends crossed to the other side of the street to avoid her. The children who had played with Clara were forbidden from speaking to her. Within weeks, Margaret Holloway and her daughter had become pariahs, condemned to isolation in the cabin at the edge of nowhere. 2 years. 2 years of struggling to survive on what they could grow and hunt. 2 years of watching her daughter grow thinner, of stretching every resource to its breaking point, of lying awake at night, wondering how much longer they could hold on. Clara stirred in her sleep, murmuring something that sounded like Papa. Maggie stroked her daughter's hair and whispered words of comfort that she herself did not believe. "It will be all right, sweetheart. Mama will take care of you. Everything will be all right." But even as she spoke, a question that had haunted her for 2 years surfaced once again in her mind. Why had Samuel died so quickly? He had never been sick a day in his life. He was stronger than men, half his age, able to work 12 hours at the forge without tiring. And then, in less than a single day, he was gone. She had asked Dr. Patterson about it once in those dark days after the funeral. The old physician had avoided her eyes, his hands trembling slightly as he packed his medical bag. "Sometimes these things just happen, Mrs. Holloway. The Lord works in mysterious ways." But there had been something in his expression, a flicker of something that looked almost like guilt or fear. Maggie had tried to question him further, but he had hurried away and had barely spoken to her since. "What did you know, Samuel?" she whispered to the wind. "What did you find out that someone did not want you to know?" The question remained unanswered, as it had remained unanswered for 2 years. Perhaps it would stay that way forever. Perhaps she would never know the truth about her husband's death. But something deep in Maggie's heart refused to accept that. Something told her that the truth was still out there, waiting to be discovered. If only she could survive long enough to find it. 10 miles south of the Holloway cabin, a lone rider made his way slowly along a mountain trail that wound through stands of pine and spruce. The man walked beside his horse, rather than riding, one hand gripping the reins, while the other rested on the worn leather of his holster. Caleb Thornton was 32 years old, though the lines around his eyes and the weariness in his bones made him feel decades older. He had spent more than half his life in the saddle, drifting from one place to another across the vast expanse of the American West. Ranches, mining camps, cattle drives, frontier towns, whose names he had already forgotten. He had seen them all and left them all behind. His horse, a buckskin mare named Dusty, limped beside him with each step. She had thrown a shoe 5 miles back, and despite Caleb's attempts at temporary repair, her left rear hoof was clearly causing her pain. They needed to find shelter and proper supplies, but this remote stretch of Wyoming seemed determined to offer neither. Easy, girl. Caleb patted Dusty's neck reassuringly. We will find somewhere to rest soon. The horse nickered softly as if she understood his words, but doubted his promise. Caleb could not blame her. He had made a lot of promises over the years that he had failed to keep. To himself, to others, to the memory of people who no longer walk this earth. The war had ended 14 years ago, but sometimes it felt like yesterday. Caleb had served in the Union Army under General Sherman, had marched through the burning South and witnessed horrors that still visited him in his dreams. The sound of artillery, the screams of dying men, the smell of blood and gunpowder that seemed to have seeped into his very soul. He had survived when so many others had not. Sometimes he wondered if that was a blessing or a curse. After the war, Caleb had tried to go home to Pennsylvania, but home no longer existed. While he had been fighting in the South, a fire had swept through his family's farm, claiming the lives of his parents and his younger sister. There had been nothing left but ashes and memories, nothing to go back to. So he had gone west instead. 15 years of wandering, of working odd jobs and keeping his head down, of never staying in one place long enough to form attachments. He told himself that he preferred it this way. That freedom meant having no ties, no responsibilities, no one waiting for him at the end of the day. But in the quiet moments when he sat alone beside a campfire and watched the stars wheel overhead, he sometimes wondered if this was really freedom at all, or if it was just another form of running away. There was another reason Caleb never stayed anywhere too long, a reason that cut deeper than the wounds of war or the grief of losing his family. 6 years ago, in a small town called Redemption, Kansas, he had been betrayed by someone he considered a friend. Jedediah Craw had seemed like a decent enough fellow when Caleb first met him. A bit rough around the edges perhaps, but friendly and eager to please. They had worked together at a cattle ranch for several months, sharing meals and stories, and the kind of easy companionship that developed between men who labored side by side. Caleb had trusted him. That had been his mistake. When cattle began disappearing from ranches throughout the region, suspicion fell on the cowboys who had access to the herds. Caleb had not worried. He had done nothing wrong, and surely the truth would come out. But then Jedediah Craw had vanished in the night, and the evidence he left behind pointed directly at Caleb Thornton. Stolen money hidden in Caleb's bedroll, a forged bill of sale with Caleb's signature, witnesses who suddenly remembered seeing Caleb in places he had never been. The ranchers had formed a lynch mob before sundown. Caleb had been dragged from his bunk and marched to the hanging tree at the edge of town, a noose already prepared for his neck. He would have died that night if not for an unexpected witness. A traveling preacher who had passed through the area on the night of the theft and could testify that Caleb had been with him discussing scripture at the very moment the cattle were being stolen. The mob had dispersed, grumbling about wasted time and false accusations. But the damage had been done. Caleb's reputation was ruined. No one in Redemption would hire him. No one would look him in the eye. He had left that same night and had never gone back. Since then, Caleb had kept his distance from others. He worked alone when possible, avoided making friends, trusted no one but himself and his horse. It was safer that way. No one could betray you if you never let them close enough to Tremont. The afternoon sun had begun its descent toward the western mountains when Caleb spotted something through the trees, a thin curl of smoke rising from a valley below. Where there was smoke, there was warmth, and possibly someone willing to help a stranded traveler. He led Dusty down the slope, moving carefully over the rocky terrain. As he drew closer, a small cabin came into view. It was nestled against the base of a rocky hillside, partially hidden by a stand of pine trees. From a distance, the cabin looked abandoned. The path leading to it was overgrown with weeds and wild grass, as if no one had traveled it in months or perhaps years. The fence surrounding the property was falling apart, several posts leaning at dangerous angles, and boards missing entirely. The roof showed signs of damage, sagging in places where repairs had been neglected. But the smoke from the chimney proved that someone still lived here, someone who was clearly struggling to survive. Caleb tied Dusty to a fence post that still seemed sturdy enough to hold her and approached the front door. He moved slowly, keeping his hands visible. Frontier folk were often suspicious of strangers, and he had learned long ago that approaching an isolated cabin too quickly could get a man shot. He had barely raised his hand to knock when the door swung open a few inches, revealing a pair of brown eyes filled with fear and suspicion. A woman stood there. She was perhaps 30 years of age, with auburn hair pulled back in a simple braid that had begun to come loose around her face. Her features were fine, but drawn her cheeks hollow from what looked like months of insufficient food. She was beautiful despite the obvious hardship, with the kind of quiet dignity that came from carrying heavy burdens without complaint. Behind her, barely visible in the shadows, a small figure clung to the woman's worn dress. A child, Caleb realized. A little girl with the same brown eyes as her mother. The woman held a broom in her hands like a weapon, though her arms trembled with the effort of keeping it raised. She was clearly terrified, but she stood her ground between Caleb and the child behind her. "Ma'am, I apologize for appearing unannounced." Caleb removed his hat and held it against his chest, letting her see his face clearly in the fading afternoon light. "My name is Caleb Thornton. My horse threw a shoe several miles back and she is injured. I was hoping someone here might be able to help, or at least allow me to rest her before continuing on." The woman did not lower the broom. Her eyes swept over him from head to toe, searching for any sign of threat, any reason to slam the door and bar it against him. "People do not come here." Her voice was hoarse, as if she had not used it for conversation in a very long time. "They say this cabin is cursed. They say tragedy lives within these walls." Caleb tilted his head slightly, studying her face. He saw the exhaustion there, the pain, the loneliness that mirrored something deep within himself. "Ma'am, I do not believe in curses. I believe in honest work and in the kindness that people are capable of showing one another. If you are in need, I would be honored to help in any way I can. If you wish me to leave, I will respect your wishes, though my horse is suffering greatly." For a long moment, silence stretched between them. The only sounds were the whisper of wind through the pines and the distant call of a hawk circling overhead. Then the little girl peered around her mother's skirt, her eyes wide with curiosity rather than fear. Unlike her mother, the child seemed more fascinated than frightened by the stranger at their door. "Mama, he has a horse." The child's voice was soft with wonder. A real horse. Something in the woman's expression changed. The rigid fear in her shoulders relaxed just slightly, and she lowered the broom a few inches. "My name is Margaret Holloway. This is my daughter Clara. You may come inside, Mr. Thornton. But I must warn you that what people say about this place has some truth to it. Tragedy did visit us here. My husband passed away 2 winters ago. Folks in town decided that we were cursed after that. They stopped coming. They stopped helping. They left us here alone to survive or perish as fate decided." Caleb felt his heart clench at her words. He stepped inside the cabin and immediately noticed how sparse it was. The furniture was simple but clean, the signs of a woman who maintained her dignity despite impossible circumstances. A small fire crackled in the stone hearth, barely sufficient to warm the single room. On a rough wooden table sat half a loaf of bread that looked like it had been carefully rationed over many days. These people were starving. Slowly, quietly starving in a cabin that the world had abandoned. Clara tugged at her mother's hand, bouncing with barely contained excitement. "Can I pet the horse, Mama? Please, can I?" Margaret looked at Caleb, a question in her eyes. "Dusty is gentle as a summer breeze," he assured her, "but she is hurting right now. Perhaps after I tend to her leg, Miss Clara can give her a treat. A carrot or an apple if you have one to spare." The light in Clara's face dimmed like a candle being snuffed out. We do not have apples, mister. We do not have much of anything. The words hit Caleb harder than any punch he had ever taken. He looked at Margaret and saw embarrassment flooding her pale cheeks. We manage, she said quickly, the words practiced and defensive. We do not need charity. Caleb nodded slowly, choosing his next words with care. I understand, ma'am. Pride is a valuable thing out here. It is often all we have left when everything else has been taken from us. But accepting help offered with a sincere heart is also valuable. I have some supplies in my saddlebags. Coffee, dried meat, some biscuits. I would be very grateful if you would share a meal with me tonight. It gets lonely eating alone on the trail. Margaret studied him for a long moment, as if trying to determine whether he was real or some dream that would disappear come morning. Finally, slowly, she nodded. That evening, they sat around the small table as the fire painted dancing shadows on the cabin walls. The meal was simple, but felt like a feast compared to what Margaret and Clara had been surviving on. Caleb had brought out everything. He had dried venison, hardtack biscuits, a small pouch of ground coffee, even a few pieces of hard candy that he had been saving for no particular reason. Clara chattered excitedly between bites, words tumbling out of her as if a dam had broken. She told Caleb about the books her mother had been teaching her to read about the wild rabbits that sometimes came near the cabin in the early mornings, about the stars she liked to count on clear nights when sleep would not come. Caleb listened to every word and as if it were the most important story he had ever heard. There was something precious about this child's innocence, something sacred about the way she found joy in small things despite the hardships she had endured. And there was something about her mother that Caleb could not look away from. Margaret Holloway carried herself with a quiet strength that he had rarely seen. She had been beaten down by life, abandoned by her community, left to raise a child alone in a wilderness that showed no mercy. Yet she had not broken. She had not surrendered. That kind of resilience was rare. That kind of courage was beautiful. After Clara had fallen asleep on a small cot near the fire wrapped in a threadbare blanket that had seen better days, Margaret poured Caleb a cup of coffee and sat across from him at the table. You should leave in the morning. Her voice was quiet, careful not to wake her daughter. People will talk if they learn you came here. They will treat you the way they treat us. Let them talk. Caleb wrapped his hands around the warm cup, appreciating its heat after so many cold nights on the trail. I have never been one to live my life according to the opinions of others. You do not understand. Margaret's eyes glistened in the firelight, old pain rising to the surface. My husband Samuel was a good man, a hard worker, but he was also different. He believed in giving everyone a fair chance regardless of their past. He hired workers that others would not touch. Former prisoners trying to rebuild their lives. People of color. Women that society had discarded. He believed everyone deserved dignity and opportunity. The town hated him for it. She paused, struggling to compose herself. When he died from the fever, people said it was punishment. They said God had struck him down for his sins. They stopped trading with us. They refused to sell us supplies. We have been surviving on what we can grow and hunt ever since. Caleb set down his cup and leaned forward. Mrs. Holloway, your husband sounds like one of the finest men who ever lived. Anyone who punishes a widow and child for the kindness of their kin is no Christian in my book. They are cowards, plain and simple. And cowards always find excuses for their cruelty. Tears spilled down Margaret's cheeks, and she quickly wiped them away, as if embarrassed by the display of emotion. You are the first person to say that in 2 years, Mr. Thornton. Please call me Caleb. And I mean every word. The next morning, Caleb told himself he should leave. He had a job waiting for him at a ranch 2 days' ride south. He had responsibilities, obligations, a life that did not include a lonely widow and her daughter in a cabin that the world had forgotten. But when he stepped outside and saw little Clara trying to carry an armload of firewood that was twice her size, something inside him shifted. Something that had been frozen for years began to thaw. He walked over and gently took the logs from her small arms. Allow me, Miss Clara. A gentleman always helps a lady with heavy burdens. Clara beamed up at him, her face lighting up like the sun breaking through storm clouds. Are you a real cowboy, mister? Caleb, I reckon I am. Then you must be very brave. Mama says cowboys ride through danger without ever being scared. Caleb knelt down to meet her eyes, something he rarely did with anyone. Can I tell you a secret, Miss Clara? The little girl nodded solemnly, her eyes wide with anticipation. Cowboys get scared all the time. The difference is that we do not let fear stop us from doing what is right. Being brave does not mean you are never afraid. It means you keep going even when you are terrified. Clara considered this wisdom with the seriousness that only a child could muster. Then she nodded as if he had shared the secrets of the universe. I will remember that, Mr. Caleb. I will be braver like you. He stayed that day to repair a broken fence post that had been leaning dangerously. He stayed the next day to fix a leak in the roof that had been dripping water onto Margaret's bed every time it rained. He stayed the day after that to chop enough firewood to see them through the approaching winter. A week passed then, too. Each morning, Caleb told himself he would leave. Each evening, he found another reason to stay. Another repair that needed doing. Another skill he could teach Clara. Another conversation with Margaret that stretched long into the night. The truth was that he had stopped looking for reasons to stay. This cabin, this woman, this child, they had become his reason. For the first time in 15 years of wandering, Caleb Thornton had found something worth stopping for. Margaret noticed the change in him. She noticed how his eyes lingered on her face when she laughed at something Clara said. She noticed how his hands trembled slightly when he passed her a plate at supper. She noticed how he looked at her as if she were the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. And she noticed how her own heart had begun to race whenever he was near. It frightened her. After Samuel's death, she had built walls around her heart, convinced that she would never let anyone in again. The pain of losing him had been too great, the betrayal of the townspeople too complete. She had decided that she and Clara would survive on their own, needing no one, trusting no one. But Caleb Thornton had somehow slipped past those walls without even trying. He had simply been himself, kind and strong and gentle, and she had found herself caring for him before she even realized it was happening. One evening after Clara had fallen asleep, Margaret found Caleb sitting on the porch staring up at the stars. The night was clear and cold, the kind of autumn evening that reminded you how small you were beneath the vast expanse of the universe. May I join you, she asked. He shifted to make room for her on the wooden step, and she sat beside him close enough that their shoulders almost touched. The warmth of his body was a comfort against the chill of the night air. I should have left weeks ago, he said quietly. Why did you not? Caleb turned to look at her, his dark eyes reflecting the moonlight. Because leaving you would be like leaving the only home I have ever truly found. And that terrifies me more than any danger I have ever faced. Margaret felt her breath catch in her throat. Caleb, I am a widow with a child and a cursed reputation. I have nothing to offer you except trouble. He reached over and gently took her hand in his. His fingers were rough from years of hard work, but his touch was tender, almost reverent. You have offered me everything, Margaret. You have offered me a family. You have offered me purpose. You have offered me something I never knew I was missing. Please do not call that nothing. Tears streamed down her face, but for the first time in 2 years, they were not tears of grief or despair. They were tears of something she had not allowed herself to feel since Samuel's death. Hope. I am afraid, she whispered. I am afraid to hope again. I am afraid of losing someone I love a second time. Caleb lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles. Then let me hope for both of us. Let me be brave enough for all three of us. Just give me a chance, Margaret. That is all I ask. She looked into his eyes and saw something she had not expected to see. She saw a future. She saw summer mornings and winter nights. She saw Clara growing up with a father figure who would teach her to ride and read and believe in herself. She saw love real and lasting and true. Yes, she breathed. Yes, Caleb. He smiled, and it was like the sun breaking through storm clouds after a long and terrible night. But even as they sat there, hands intertwined beneath the starlight, neither of them noticed the shadow that watched from the tree line. A figure on horseback silhouetted against the darker darkness of the forest, observing their tender moment with cold and calculating eyes. The figure had been watching the cabin for several days now, gathering information, planning his next move. He had come to this isolated place for a reason that had nothing to do with love or redemption, and everything to do with secrets buried and debts unpaid. Jedediah Cross smiled in the darkness. It seemed that his old friend Caleb Thornton had finally stopped running. How convenient that he had chosen to stop here of all places, at the cabin of Samuel Holloway's widow. This was going to be even easier than he had thought. Jed turned his horse and melted back into the shadows of the forest, already planning his next move. The game was about to begin, and this time he intended to win everything. Back on the porch, Caleb felt a sudden chill run down his spine. He turned to look at the tree line, his instincts honed by years of living on the edge, screaming that something was wrong. "What is it?" Margaret asked, sensing his tension. "Nothing." He forced himself to relax, though his hand moved unconsciously to rest on the pistol at his hip. "Just the wind." But even as he said it, he knew it was a lie. Something was out there, something dangerous, and it was coming for them. The days that followed were the happiest that Margaret had experienced since Samuel's death. Caleb proved himself to be a man of his word in every way, working tirelessly to transform their struggling homestead into something approaching a real home. He reinforced the walls of the cabin against the coming winter, patching holes and sealing cracks that had let the cold creep in. He repaired the chicken coop so completely that the remaining hens began laying more eggs than they had in months. He built a new outhouse to replace the one that had been threatening to collapse. He cleared the overgrown path that led from the cabin to the main road, making the journey to town shorter and easier. But it was not just his physical labor that changed things. It was his presence, his steady, reassuring presence that made Margaret feel safe for the first time in 2 years. He taught Clara to ride on Dusty's back, holding her steady with patient hands while she giggled with delight. He read stories to her before bed, doing different voices for each character, until she laughed so hard she could barely breathe. He answered her endless questions with thoughtful patience, never dismissing her curiosity or making her feel foolish for asking. And every evening, he sat with Margaret on the porch, holding her hand as the sun set behind the mountains, talking about dreams they had both thought were lost forever. For Clara, it was like having a father again. For Margaret, it was like having a partner, someone to share the burdens that had been crushing her for so long. For Caleb, it was like finally understanding what he had been searching for all those years of wandering. Not freedom from responsibility, but freedom to love. Not escape from connection, but connection itself. He had found his home, not in a place, but in the people who lived there. Yet even in those golden days, shadows lurked at the edges of their happiness. Margaret began to notice things that troubled her. Small signs that someone had been near the cabin during the night. Footprints in the soft earth around the chicken coop. Broken twigs along the path. A sense of being watched that she could not shake. She mentioned it to Caleb, who nodded grimly. He had noticed too, and he had his suspicions about who might be watching. But he kept those suspicions to himself. He did not want to frighten Margaret, and he still was not certain. It could have been animals. It could have been his imagination running wild after too many years of looking over his shoulder. But deep in his gut, Caleb knew the truth. His past had found him, and it was only a matter of time before it made its presence known. That time came on a night when the moon hung full and bright in the October sky. Margaret and Clara had gone to bed early, exhausted from a day spent harvesting the last vegetables from the garden before the frost claimed them. Caleb sat alone on the porch, unable to sleep, a feeling of impending doom settling over him like a shroud. He heard the hoofbeats before he saw the rider. They came from the direction of the forest, steady and unhurried, the pace of someone who knew exactly where they were going and was in no rush to get there. Caleb rose to his feet, his hand moving to rest on the grip of his pistol. Every muscle in his body tensed, every sense sharpened to a razor edge. The rider emerged from the tree line and stopped about 20 feet from the cabin. In the moonlight, Caleb could make out a figure that was both familiar and hated, a face he had hoped never to see again. Jedediah Cross sat astride his horse, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Caleb Thornton. His voice dripped with false warmth. "It has been too long, old friend." Caleb did not move, did not blink, did not allow any emotion to show on his face. "We are not friends, Jed. We never were." Jed placed a hand over his heart in mock hurt. "That wounds me, Caleb. After everything we went through together, after all those nights sharing stories by the campfire, after you tried to get me hanged for crimes you committed." The false warmth vanished from Jed's face, replaced by something colder and more honest. "The past is the past. I have come to discuss the future." Behind Caleb, the cabin door opened, and Margaret stepped out, drawn by the sound of voices. When she saw the figure on horseback, her face went pale with recognition. "You." Her voice shook with a mixture of fear and fury. "You are Jedediah Craw, the man who betrayed my husband." Jed turned his attention to her, his smile returning. "Ah, Mrs. Holloway, You are even more beautiful than I remembered. Widowhood becomes you. Caleb stepped between them, his body a shield between the predator and his prey. What do you want? Jed's eyes glittered in the moonlight. I want what Samuel Holloway promised me before he died. I want the treasure. There is no treasure. Margaret's voice was stronger now, anger replacing fear. Samuel had nothing except what he earned through honest work. Everything he left behind I have already used to survive. Jed laughed a cold and unpleasant sound. You expect me to believe that Samuel talked about his savings all the time. Money and gold that he had been collecting for years, hidden somewhere safe. He trusted me like a brother. He told me things he did not even tell his own wife. Then he was a fool. Margaret's chin lifted defiantly. And so are you if you think there is anything here worth stealing. Jed's expression darkened. I am not asking Mrs. Holloway. I am telling. You will give me what I came for or there will be consequences. Caleb drew his pistol in one smooth motion, the barrel pointed directly at Jed's chest. The only consequence I see is you catching a bullet if you do not ride away right now. For a long moment, the two men stared at each other across the moonlit clearing. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Then Jed smiled again, that infuriating, knowing smile that made Caleb want to pull the trigger regardless of the consequences. Not tonight, old friend. I did not come here to fight. I came to deliver a message. He leaned forward in his saddle. This is not over. I will have what I came for one way or another. And I am not alone. I have friends in town and important friends who share my interest in seeing you and your new family suffer. He turned his horse, preparing to leave, but paused for one final word. By the way, Caleb, did you ever wonder how Samuel Holloway really died? Did you ever ask yourself why a man in perfect health dropped dead in less than a day? Before Caleb could respond, Jed spurred his horse and disappeared into the darkness of the forest, his laughter echoing behind him like the call of some malevolent spirit. Margaret grabbed Caleb's arm, her face pale with terror. Caleb, what did he mean? What does he know about Samuel's death? Caleb holstered his pistol and pulled her close, feeling her tremble against him. I do not know yet, but I intend to find out. They stood there in the moonlight, holding each other as the echoes of Jed's laughter faded into silence. The night that had begun with such peace had been shattered by the arrival of something dark and dangerous. The past had caught up with both of them, and now there was nowhere left to run. That night, after Margaret had finally fallen into a fitful sleep, Caleb sat by the dying fire and thought about everything Jed had said, about treasure and secrets in the suspicious circumstances of Samuel Holloway's death. He thought about the connections that fate had woven between them all. Jed had betrayed him 6 years ago in Redemption. Jed had betrayed Samuel Holloway 2 years ago in Willow Creek. And now, by some cruel twist of destiny, Caleb had found his way to the cabin of the man who had suffered the same betrayal. This was not coincidence. This was something else. Providence, perhaps, or the universe's way of offering a chance at justice. Caleb looked at the door to the small room where Margaret and Clara slept, and he made a silent vow. He would protect them. He would uncover the truth about Samuel's death. And if Jed had indeed killed an innocent man, Caleb would make sure he paid for it, no matter what it cost him. The wind howled outside the cabin, carrying whispers of winter on its breath. But inside, despite the darkness that pressed against the windows, a small flame of hope continued to burn. Caleb Thornton had spent 15 years running from his past. Tonight he had finally decided to stand and fight. For Margaret, for Clara, for the family he had never expected to find, and for the justice that Samuel Holloway deserved. The days following Jedediah Craw's midnight visit were marked by a tension that hung over the cabin like storm clouds refusing to break. Caleb found himself sleeping lighter than ever, one hand always within reach of his pistol, his ears attuned to every sound that pierced the night silence. Margaret tried to maintain a sense of normalcy for Clara's sake, but the strange showed in the dark circles beneath her eyes and the way her gaze constantly drifted toward the tree line. Yet even in the shadow of danger, life continued. It had to. There were chores to be done, meals to prepare, a child to raise. And somewhere in the midst of all that necessity, love continued to grow between two people who had both thought their hearts were beyond repair. Caleb threw himself into work with renewed intensity, as if building a fortress around the cabin could somehow keep the darkness at bay. He reinforced the doors with iron bars salvaged from the ruins of Samuel's old blacksmith shop. He cleared sight lines around the property, cutting back brush and overgrown trees that could provide cover for anyone approaching with ill intent. He taught Margaret to load and fire his spare rifle, drilling her until she could hit a target at 50 yards. She learned quickly, her jaw set with determination. If they come for us, I will not be helpless. Not again. Caleb watched her practice, pride and fear warring in his chest. He prayed she would never need to use that skill. But he had seen enough of the world to know that prayers were not always answered. Clara, blessedly unaware of the adult concerns swirling around her, continued to be a source of light in the darkness. She had taken to following Caleb around like a shadow, peppering him with questions about everything from how to shoe a horse to why the sky turned orange at sunset. He answered each question with patience and care, finding that explaining the world to a curious child helped him see it with fresh eyes. One afternoon, while Clara was helping him stack firewood, she looked up at him with those serious brown eyes that reminded him so much of her mother. "Mr. Caleb, are you going to be my papa now?" The question caught him off guard. He set down the log he was carrying and knelt to meet her gaze. "Would you like that, Miss Clara?" She nodded solemnly. "Mama smiles more when you are here." She did not smile for a very long time after Papa went to heaven, but now she smiles again. "I think you make her happy." Caleb felt his throat tighten with emotion. "Your mama makes me happy too, and so do you." "Then you should stay forever," Clara declared with the simple logic of childhood. "That way we can all be happy together." He pulled her into a hug, this precious child who had somehow claimed a piece of his heart he did not even know was empty. "I am not going anywhere," he promised. "Not ever." It was a promise he intended to keep, no matter what. But keeping that promise would require confronting the shadows that circled ever closer. 3 days after Jed's visit, Caleb discovered evidence that confirmed his worst suspicions. He found fresh tracks near the chicken coop, boot prints that did not match his own or Margaret's. The chickens had been disturbed, their feathers scattered, though none had been taken. A message. Jed was letting them know he could reach them whenever he wanted. The next morning, one of the chickens was found dead in the coop. Its neck had been wrung, a clean and deliberate kill that no wild animal could have accomplished. Caleb disposed of the carcass before Clara could see it, but he could not hide the truth from Margaret. "He is playing with us," she said, her voice tight with controlled fury, "like a cat toying with mice before the kill. He wants us scared." Caleb stared out the window at the peaceful seeming landscape that had become a battlefield. Scared people make mistakes. They give up things they should not give up. They tell secrets they should keep. What secrets does he think we have? I do not know, but I intend to find out. That evening, after Clara had gone to sleep, Caleb sat down with Margaret and told her everything. About his past with Jed and redemption, about the betrayal that had nearly cost him his life, about the years of running and hiding and never trusting anyone. Margaret listened without interruption, her face pale in the firelight. When he finished, she reached across the table and took his hands in hers. "You should have told me sooner, I know. I was afraid. Afraid that if you knew about my past, you would think I brought this trouble to your door. You did not bring anything." She squeezed his hands tightly. "Jed brought himself. And whatever his reasons, they started long before you arrived here. You believed that I believe that God does not make mistakes. You came to this cabin when we needed you most. That was not coincidence. That was providence." Caleb looked into her eyes and saw something he had not seen in a very long time. Faith. Not just faith in God, but faith in him. It was a gift he was not sure he deserved, but one he would spend the rest of his life trying to earn. "There is something else," Margaret said slowly. "Something I never told anyone because I was not sure if it was real or just my imagination." "What is it?" In the weeks before Samuel died, he changed. He became secretive, nervous. He would check the locks on the doors multiple times each night. He would wake at the smallest sound and reach for his rifle. Caleb leaned forward. "Did he tell you why he said he had discovered something? Something important about Jed, about the cattle thefts that had happened before Jed disappeared. He said he had proof that Jed was not working alone, that there was someone else involved. Someone in town, someone powerful." "Did he say who?" Margaret shook her head. "He said he needed to be certain before he made accusations. He was going to confront Jed one more time, give him a chance to confess and turn himself in. He believed in redemption even for people who had wronged him." She paused, her voice breaking. "The night before he died, I heard him talking to someone outside the blacksmith shop. When I asked him about it, he said it was just a late customer, but his hands were shaking and he would not look me in the eye. The next morning, he was dead. Caleb felt the pieces of a terrible puzzle beginning to fall into place. Jed came back. He came back to silence Samuel before he could reveal the truth. But Jed was supposed to have left the territory months before Samuel died. Everyone said so. Everyone said what they were told to say. Caleb's jaw tightened. Or what they were paid to say. Or what they were threatened into saying. You think Jed killed Samuel? I think we need to find out for certain. And I think there is one person who might know the truth. Who? Dr. Patterson. He was the one who examined Samuel's body. He was the one who declared it brain fever. And he was the one who could not look you in the eye afterward. Margaret's face went pale. You think he knows something? I think he is afraid of something. And fear usually has a source. The next morning, Caleb rode to town alone. It was a risk leaving Margaret and Clara unprotected, but he needed answers that only Dr. Patterson could provide. He left Margaret with the rifle and strict instructions to bolt the door and not open it for anyone until he returned. The ride to Willow Creek took less than an hour, but it felt like crossing into enemy territory. The townspeople watched him pass with a mixture of curiosity and hostility. Whispers followed in his wake like rustling leaves. That is him, the drifter staying at the cursed cabin. What kind of fool would live there? Maybe he is cursed too now. Maybe the evil has spread. Caleb ignored them all and made his way to Dr. Patterson's small office on the edge of town. The building was modest, a single-story structure with a hand-painted sign that read, Henry Patterson, M.D., in faded letters. He tied Dusty to the hitching post and stepped inside without knocking. The office was dim and cluttered shelves lined with bottles and jars and medical instruments that looked like they belonged in a different century. Dr. Patterson sat behind a desk covered in papers, a pair of spectacles perched on his nose. He was older than Caleb had expected, perhaps 70, with thinning white hair and hands that trembled slightly as he worked. The old man looked up at Caleb's entrance, and something flickered across his face. Recognition and fear. Mr. Thornton. His voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed him. I heard you were staying at the Holloway place. What brings you to my office? Are you unwell? I am fine. Caleb closed the door behind him and stood with his back against it. But I have some questions about Samuel Holloway, questions that need honest answers. Dr. Patterson's face went pale. I do not know what you mean. Samuel died of brain fever. It was a tragedy, but these things happen. No, Caleb took a step forward, and the old man flinched. Samuel Holloway was murdered. You know it, I know it. And it is time the truth came out. I cannot help you. Patterson stood abruptly, nearly knocking over his chair. Please leave my office. If Silas Brennan learns you were here asking questions. So Silas Brennan is involved. The doctor's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. He realized too late that he had revealed more than he intended. Caleb pressed his advantage. Listen to me carefully, doctor. Margaret Holloway has been living in isolation for 2 years because of lies told by people in this town. Her daughter is growing up hungry and afraid because cowards like you were too scared to speak the truth. That ends now. You do not understand. Patterson's voice dropped to a whisper. Silas Brennan controls this town. He owns half the businesses and has influence over the other half. When he decides someone is guilty, they are guilty. When he decides someone is innocent, they are innocent. Anyone who crosses him ends up ruined, or worse. Then help me ruin him first. The old man stared at Caleb for a long moment. Something shifted in his eyes, a war between self-preservation and conscience that had been raging for 2 years. Finally, his shoulders slumped in defeat. Samuel Holloway did not die of brain fever, he said quietly. He was poisoned. I knew it the moment I examined his body. The symptoms, the speed of his decline, it all pointed to deliberate poisoning. Likely a toxic mushroom ground into powder and slipped into his food or drink. Caleb felt cold fury rising in his chest. You knew this, and you said nothing. Silas Brennan came to me before I could report my findings. He made it very clear what would happen if I told anyone the truth. My practice would be destroyed. My reputation would be ruined. And he implied that accidents could happen. Fatal accidents. So you let a murderer go free. I was afraid. Patterson's voice cracked with shame. I was a coward. I have lived with that guilt every day for 2 years. Every time I see Margaret Holloway struggling to survive, I know that I could have helped her. I could have spoken up, but I was too weak. Caleb stood silent, processing this confession. Part of him wanted to drag the old man to the sheriff and force him to repeat everything under oath. But another part understood the power of fear, how it could paralyze even decent people and make them complicit in terrible things. "You have a chance to make it right," Caleb said finally. "When the time comes, will you testify to what you know?" Dr. Patterson met his eyes, and for the first time, something like resolve appeared in his weathered face. "Yes, I have been carrying this burden long enough. Whatever happens, I will tell the truth." Caleb nodded and turned to leave. Then he paused at the door. "One more question. Do you have any idea who actually administered the poison?" Patterson hesitated. "I cannot be certain, but a few weeks before Samuel died, someone fitting Jedediah Craw's description was seen in the area. People assumed he had left the territory long before, but there were rumors of sightings, a figure lurking in the woods, a stranger asking questions about Samuel Holloway. Caleb absorbed this information. Then he stepped out into the autumn sunlight, his mind already working on the next step. The pieces were falling into place. Jed had killed Samuel to silence him before he could reveal the truth about the cattle thefts and their powerful accomplice. Silas Brennan had covered up the murder to protect himself using fear and intimidation to keep the townspeople in line. And Margaret and Clara had been made to suffer for 2 years because of their lies. Justice was coming. Caleb would make sure of it. He returned to the cabin to find Margaret and Clara safe, though clearly anxious about his absence. Over supper, he told Margaret what he had learned from Dr. Patterson, watching her face cycle through shock grief and finally a cold and terrible anger. Samuel was murdered. Her voice was flat, controlled, but her eyes burned with fury. "My husband was murdered, and they let me believe it was God's punishment for his kindness. I am sorry, Margaret. I wish the truth were different." "No, do not be sorry. Be ready." She looked at him with a fierce determination that made his heart swell with admiration. "When we bring these men to justice, I want to be there. I want to look them in the eyes and make sure they know that Samuel Holloway's widow was not broken by their cruelty. You are the bravest woman I have ever known." "I am a mother," she said simply. Mothers do not have the luxury of being afraid. The following week was a strange mixture of preparation and domesticity. Caleb continued to fortify the cabin, while Margaret worked on gathering evidence of the townspeople's treatment of her over the past 2 years. She documented every instance of refused service, every hateful word spoken to her daughter, every night they had gone hungry because no one would sell them food. Clara, oblivious to the darkness surrounding them, bloomed under Caleb's attention. She learned to brush Dusty's coat until it shone like copper in the sunlight. She practiced her reading with the religious dedication determined to impress her mother and her new almost father. She laughed more than she had in 2 years, and that laughter was the sweetest sound either adult had ever heard. In the quiet evenings after Clara had gone to sleep, Caleb and Margaret would sit together on the porch holding hands and talking about the future. About the wedding they hoped to have once this nightmare was over. About expanding the cabin to make room for more children. About building a life together that no one could take from them. "I never thought I would have this again," Margaret confessed one night. "After Samuel died, I closed off that part of myself. I decided I would survive for Clara, but I would not live. Not really. And now I want to live." She turned to face him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "You gave me that, Caleb. You gave me hope. You gave yourself hope. I just reminded you it was possible." She leaned in and kissed him, soft and tender and full of promise. It was only their second kiss, but it felt like coming home. Neither of them saw the figures watching from the darkness of the forest. 3 men on horseback, their faces obscured by shadow, their intentions clear only to themselves. Jed had found allies, and he was done waiting. The attack came at dawn 1 week before Caleb and Margaret had planned to ride to the territorial marshal with their evidence. Clara had been complaining of stomach pains the night before, and Margaret had dismissed it as too much excitement. But when Caleb went to check on the child in the morning, his blood ran cold. Clara lay in her small bed, face flushed with fever, body trembling with chills. Her eyes were glassy and unfocused, and when she tried to speak, only nonsense came out. The symptoms were unmistakable. The same symptoms Dr. Patterson had described when talking about Samuel's death. Clara had been poisoned. Margaret Caleb shouted, his voice cracking with fear. Margaret, come quickly! She burst through the door seconds later, and when she saw her daughter, the color drained from her face. No. She rushed to Clara's side, gathering the child in her arms. No, no, no. Not my baby. Please, God, not my baby. Caleb was already moving, grabbing his coat and hat. I am getting Dr. Patterson. Keep her warm and try to get her to drink water. I will be back as fast as I can. But they will not let him come. They will not help us. They will help us if I have to drag them at gunpoint. He burst out the door and leaped onto Dusty's back without bothering with a saddle. The mare sensed his urgency and flew down the path toward town, her hooves pounding the earth like thunder. The ride that normally took an hour took less than 40 minutes. Caleb pushed Dusty harder than he ever had, knowing that every second could mean the difference between life and death for the little girl who had stolen his heart. He arrived in Willow Creek like a storm, scattering pedestrians and drawing stares as he galloped down the main street. He did not slow until he reached Dr. Patterson's office, where he threw himself from the saddle and crashed through the door. The old doctor looked up from his breakfast, startled by the violent interruption. Clara has been poisoned, Caleb's words came out in a rush. The same way Samuel was poisoned. You have to come now, please. Patterson's face went white, but he did not hesitate. He grabbed his medical bag and followed Caleb outside, ignoring the townspeople who were beginning to gather to watch the commotion. Silas Brennan pushed through the crowd, his face red with anger. Patterson, what do you think you are doing? I told you never to go near that cabin. The old doctor drew himself up to his full height. A child is dying, Silas. Whatever differences we have, I will not let an innocent girl perish when I have the power to help her. If you go there, you are finished in this town. Everything you have built will be destroyed. Then so be it. Dr. Patterson climbed onto the back of Caleb's horse, and before Brennan could say another word, they were racing back toward the cabin. Caleb could feel the old man trembling behind him, but he held on tight, determined to reach Clara in time. Please, Caleb prayed silently. Please let us be in time. They arrived to find Margaret kneeling beside Clara's bed, her face streaked with tears. The child was worse, her breathing shallow and labored, her small body convulsing with spasms. Dr. Patterson went to work immediately, pulling vials and instruments from his bag with practiced efficiency. He examined Clara's eyes, checked her pulse, felt her forehead. The same symptoms, he muttered. Exactly the same. But the dose seems lighter. Whoever did this wanted to frighten, not kill. At least not yet. Can you save her? I can try. He pulled out a bottle of dark liquid and began measuring drops into a cup. This is an emetic. It will help expel whatever poison remains in her system, but she needs to drink it, all of it, and she will be very sick for a while. Can you hold her still? Margaret nodded, her face set with grim determination. She cradled Clara's head while Caleb held her body steady. Together they managed to get the medicine down the child's throat. What followed was the longest night of their lives. Clara vomited repeatedly, her small body racked with heaves that seemed too violent for someone so young. Between bouts of sickness, she burned with fever and cried for her mother in a voice so weak it barely carried across the room. Margaret stayed by her side every moment, wiping her brow, holding her hand, whispering words of love and encouragement. Caleb paced the cabin like a caged animal, his mind racing through possibilities. Someone had gotten close enough to poison Clara. Someone had breached their defenses without being detected. Jed. It had to be Jed. But how? When the following week was a strange mixture of preparation and domesticity, Caleb continued to fortify the cabin while Margaret worked on gathering evidence. One afternoon, a traveling peddler passed through his wagon loaded with ribbons and small trinkets. Clara had been delighted by his wares, and Margaret had purchased a small doll for her. The old man had seemed harmless enough, though Caleb noticed he lingered near the well longer than necessary. Then he remembered. The day before, a traveling peddler had stopped by the cabin selling ribbons and trinkets. Clara had been delighted, and Margaret had purchased a small doll for her with some of the money Caleb had earned selling firewood in a neighboring town. The peddler had seemed harmless, a weathered old man with a friendly smile. But Caleb had not recognized him, and now thinking back, he realized the man had lingered near the well while Clara was distracted. The well, the water. He rushed outside and drew a bucket from the well. In the moonlight, the water looked clear and pure. But when he sniffed it, he caught a faint, bitter odor that did not belong. Caleb dumped the bucket and sealed the well. They would have to find another water source, but at least no more poison would enter their home. As dawn broke, Clara's fever finally began to subside. Her breathing steadied, and she fell into a natural sleep for the first time since the ordeal began. "She will live," Dr. Patterson announced, exhaustion evident in every line of his face. But it was close. Another few hours without treatment, and she might not have survived. Margaret collapsed into Caleb's arms, sobbing with relief. "Thank you. Thank you both. I do not know how to repay you. You can repay me by helping bring the men responsible to justice." Patterson's voice was hard with resolve. "I am done being afraid. I am done being complicit in their crimes. Samuel Holloway deserved better than the silence I gave him, and his daughter deserves to grow up in a world where murderers face consequences." Caleb looked at the old doctor with new respect. "You are willing to testify against Silas Brennan, against Jedediah Craw, against anyone involved in this conspiracy, whatever it takes." Margaret wiped her eyes and straightened her shoulders. "Then we need to find Jed. We need proof that he is behind this." "I know where to start," Caleb said grimly. "He has been watching us from somewhere in the forest. I have seen signs of his camp. Tonight I am going to find it. Let me come with you." "No, you need to stay with Clara. I will handle Jed." "Caleb," Margaret gripped his arm, her eyes fierce. "Promise me you will come back. Promise me you will not die out there in the darkness." He cupped her face in his hands and kissed her forehead. "I promise. Nothing in this world or the next will keep me from returning to you." Dr. Patterson agreed to stay at the cabin and watch over Clara while Caleb was gone. As night fell, Caleb loaded his pistol, strapped a knife to his belt, and slipped out into the darkness. The hunt had begun. Caleb moved through the forest like a shadow, his years of frontier experience serving him well. He knew how to read the land, how to follow signs that others would miss, how to track a man through wilderness that seemed trackless. It took him 3 hours, but he finally found what he was looking for. Jed's camp was nestled in a narrow ravine, hidden from casual observation by an outcropping of rock. A small fire burned at its center, casting flickering light on 3 figures huddled around it. Jed sat with his back against a boulder, a bottle of whiskey in his hand. 2 other men flanked him, rough-looking characters with the hard eyes of professional criminals. They spoke in low voices, occasionally laughing at some joke that Caleb could not hear. He crept closer, using every scrap of cover available. When he was within 20 feet, he drew his pistol and stepped into the light. "Jedediah Craw." His voice rang out clear and cold. "We need to talk." Jed jumped to his feet, reaching for his gun, but Caleb's weapon was already aimed at his heart. "I would not do that if I were you. I am a lot faster than I was in Redemption, and my aim has only gotten better." The 2 other men started to rise, but Caleb shifted his aim between them. "You have 2 choices, gentlemen. Leave now and never come back. Or stay and find out how many of you I can shoot before anyone gets a hand on their weapon. I guarantee it will be at least 2. The men looked at each other, then at Jed. When their leader made no move to defend them, they slowly backed away and melted into the darkness. Within moments, the sound of hoofbeats announced their departure. Now it was just Caleb and Jed. "You poisoned Clara," Caleb said, advancing slowly with his gun still raised. "A 6-year-old child who never did anything to anyone." "I did not poison anyone." Jed's voice was defensive, but his eyes told a different story. "I do not know what you are talking about. Save the lies for someone who believes them." "I found the well. I know how you did it, and I know you poisoned Samuel Holloway the same way." For the first time, something shifted in Jed's expression. A crack in the mask he wore, an admission that he had not intended to make. "Samuel Holloway was a fool," he said slowly. "He thought he could save everyone. He thought kindness would protect him from the realities of this world. He was wrong. He trusted you. He treated you like family, and that was his mistake." Jed's voice grew harder, more bitter. "When I discovered he was investigating the cattle thefts, when I realized he was going to expose me and my partner, I had to act. A little poison in his coffee, and the problem solved itself." Caleb felt cold rage building in his chest, but he kept his voice steady. "Your partner, Silas Brennan." Jed laughed, a harsh and ugly sound. "Old Silas has his fingers in everything. The cattle thefts were just the beginning. He has been skimming from every business in town for years. Samuel was getting too close to uncovering it all. Silas could not allow that, so he had you kill an innocent man. Samuel was never innocent. He was naive, which is worse. He actually believed that people could change, that I could change. Jed shook his head with mock sorrow. Some people are just born bad, Thornton. You should know that by now. Caleb stepped closer, his finger tight on the trigger. Every fiber of his being wanted to pull it, wanted to end Jed's miserable life right here, right now as payment for all the suffering he had caused. But then he thought of Margaret, of Clara, of the future they could have together if he did not throw it away in a moment of vengeance. I am not going to kill you, Caleb said finally. I am going to take you to the territorial marshal and let justice handle you properly. You think anyone will believe you, Jed sneered. You are a drifter, a nobody. Silas Brennan owns half the officials in this territory. You will never get a conviction. Maybe not, but I have something you do not expect. A witness who is willing to testify about how Samuel really died. And another witness who just heard you confess to murder. Jed's face went pale. Who? What witness, Dr. Patterson? He has been carrying the truth for 2 years, and he is finally ready to share it. For a long moment, Jed stood frozen. Then, faster than Caleb expected, he lunged forward, a knife appearing in his hand as if by magic. Caleb fired. The bullet caught Jed in the shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him to the ground. The knife flew from his grasp and landed several feet away. You should have stayed down, Caleb said, kicking the knife farther away and standing over his fallen enemy. Now you have assault to add to your charges. Jed clutched his bleeding shoulder, his face twisted with pain and hatred. This is not over, Thornton. Silas will never let you expose him. He will destroy you. He will destroy everyone you love. He can try. Caleb pulled rope from his belt and bound Jed's hands behind his back, ignoring his groans of pain. Then he hauled him to his feet and began the long walk back toward the cabin. But they had barely gone 100 yards when a new sound reached Caleb's ears, a sound that made his blood run cold. Hoofbeats, many hoofbeats, coming from the direction of the cabin, and in the distance, through the trees, he could see the glow of torches. Caleb's heart stopped. Silas Brennan had made his move. He tied Jed to a tree trunk, ignoring his protests and curses. Then he sprinted through the forest, running faster than he had ever run in his life, praying with every step that he was not too late. The cabin came into view, and his worst fears were confirmed. A mob of at least 15 men stood at the edge of the preparatory torches blazing in the darkness. Silas Brennan was at their head, his face twisted with righteous fury. And standing between the mob and the cabin, armed only with a rifle, was Margaret. Clara was still inside, too weak to move. Dr. Patterson stood at the window, his aged face pale with fear. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and out of options. Caleb emerged from the forest at a dead run, his pistol in his hand. Stop! He bellowed, his voice cutting through the night like a thunderclap. Step away from that cabin. Silas turned, surprised by the interruption. Thornton, I should have known you would interfere. I am not interfering. I am preventing a murder. Caleb positioned himself beside Margaret, their shoulders touching. Whatever strength they had, they would share it. Murder, Silas laughed, a sound devoid of humor. We are here to cleanse this land of a curse, to protect decent folk from the evil that lives in that cabin. The only evil here is you. Caleb raised his voice so the entire mob could hear. Silas Brennan is a thief and a murderer. He has been stealing from this town for years, and when Samuel Holloway discovered the truth, Brennan had him poisoned. A murmur ran through the crowd. Silas's face reddened with fury. Lies. Desperate lies from a desperate man. It is the truth. Dr. Patterson has evidence. He examined Samuel's body and found signs of poisoning. He has been silent for 2 years because Brennan threatened him, but he is ready to testify now. Patterson is a senile old fool. Silas turned to the mob. Are you going to believe a stranger and a coward over a man you have known for 20 years? But the crowd was shifting. Uncertainty replacing the certainty they had arrived with. Some of the men were looking at Brennan with new eyes. Vernon Mills stepped forward. Silas, is it true? Did you threaten Doc Patterson? Of course not. This is ridiculous. Then why did you insist we not help the Holloway widow? Why did you spread stories about curses and divine punishment? Why were you so determined to drive them out of this valley? Because they are cursed. Because Samuel Holloway was a sinner who brought his fate upon himself. Caleb saw his opening. Samuel Holloway was a man who believed in second chances. He hired people that others rejected. He gave hope to those who had none. And he died because he discovered that Silas Brennan was stealing from everyone in this town. More murmurs, more shifting feet. The torch flames seemed to waver as the conviction of the mob faltered. Silas sensed he was losing control. He whirled on the crowd, his voice rising to a shout. Are you going to listen to this outsider? This drifter who appeared from nowhere and seduced a widow? He has bewitched you all. Can you not see it? I see a frightened man, Vernon Mills said slowly. A man who has been lying to us for years. I am not lying. Then prove it. Vernon crossed his arms. Let us bring Jed Craw before the territorial marshal. Let us have Dr. Patterson testify under oath. If you are innocent, you have nothing to fear. Silas Brennan's face went through several colors, red, then white, then a sickly gray. His eyes darted around looking for support, finding none. And then he broke. You fools! His voice was a snarl. I did what I had to do. Samuel was going to ruin everything. He was going to expose me and destroy everything I built. I had no choice. The confession hung in the air like a thunderclap. You murdered him, Margaret said, her voice trembling with barely controlled emotion. You murdered my husband and let me believe it was God's punishment. He was in my way. Brennan's mask had fallen completely now, revealing the ugly truth beneath. Just like you are in my way. Just like all of you are in my way. He pulled a pistol from his coat and aimed it at Margaret. Time seemed to slow. Caleb saw the gun rising, saw Brennan's finger tightening on the trigger, saw death reaching for the woman he loved. He moved without thinking, throwing himself in front of Margaret just as the gun fired. The bullet meant for her heart struck his shoulder instead. Pain exploded through his body, but he stayed on his feet, returning fire as he fell. His shot caught Brennan in the leg, and the man collapsed with a scream. Chaos erupted. The mob surged forward, some rushing to restrain Brennan, others running to help Caleb. Vernon Mills kicked the gun away from Brennan's reaching hand, while two other men pinned him to the ground. Margaret dropped to her knees beside Caleb, tears streaming down her face. Caleb, Caleb, stay with me. Please do not leave me. He looked up at her, pain clouding his vision, but unable to dim the love he felt. Not going anywhere, he managed. Promised you remember. She laughed through her tears and pressed her hands against his wound, trying to stop the bleeding. Somebody get Dr. Patterson, she shouted, now! The old doctor was already pushing through the crowd, his medical bag in hand. Let me see him. Give me room. As Patterson worked to treat Caleb's wound, Margaret looked up at the faces surrounding them. The faces of people who had shunned her for 2 years, who had called her cursed and left her to starve. They looked different now. Ashamed, remorseful, human. We owe you an apology, Vernon Mills said quietly. All of us. We should never have believed Brennan's lies. We should have helped you when you needed it. Margaret could have raged at them, could have thrown their cruelty back in their faces. But as she looked down at Caleb, at the man who had nearly died to protect her, she found that she had no room left for hatred. We can talk about apologies later, she said. Right now, I just want to make sure the man I love survives the night. And as the mob dispersed, leaving only those who truly wanted to help, Margaret Holloway realized that the curse had finally been broken. Not by magic, not by divine intervention, but by truth and courage and the power of love to heal even the deepest wounds. Silas Brennan lay on the ground, bound and bleeding, his empire of lies crumbling around him. Jedediah Craw waited in the forest, tied to a tree, his crimes about to catch up with him at last. And in a small cabin at the edge of nowhere, a little girl was recovering from poison, her mother's love, the best medicine of all. The long night was over. Dawn was coming. The first light of dawn crept over the mountains like a blessing, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. In the small cabin that had been the center of so much pain and fear, a different kind of light was beginning to shine. The light of hope, the light of healing, the light of justice finally within reach. Caleb lay on the bed that had once belonged to Samuel Holloway, his shoulder wrapped in clean bandages, his face pale from blood loss, but his eyes clear and focused. Dr. Patterson had worked through the night to remove the bullet and stitch the wound closed. It had been a near thing. A few inches to the left, and the bullet would have pierced his heart. But Caleb Thornton was not ready to die. Not when he had finally found something worth living for. Margaret sat beside him, her hand wrapped around his, refusing to let go even for a moment. Clara slept in the corner, her fever broken, her small body finally at peace after the ordeal of the poisoning. The child would recover fully, Patterson had assured them. Children were resilient. They bounced back from things that would destroy adults. You should rest, Caleb said, his voice hoarse but steady. You have been awake for 2 days. I will rest when I know you are going to be all right. Margaret's eyes were red-rimmed from crying and exhaustion, but her grip on his hand remained firm. You took a bullet for me, Caleb. You almost died protecting me. I would do it again. 1,000 times I would do it again. She leaned down and pressed her forehead against his tears, slipping down her cheeks. I love you. I should have said it sooner, but I was afraid. I was afraid that if I admitted how much you meant to me, something would take you away. Just like Samuel was taken away. Nothing is going to take me from you. Caleb lifted his good hand and cupped her face, wiping away her tears with his thumb. We have been through fire together, Margaret. We have faced down murderers and mobs and the hatred of an entire town. After all that, do you really think anything could separate us? She laughed through her tears, a sound of pure relief. Number one, I suppose not. Then stop worrying and let me sleep. He smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face into something almost boyish. I have a wedding to recover for. Outside the cabin, the world was changing. The mob that had come to burn out the cursed widow had dispersed in the early hours of the morning, their righteous fury replaced by shame and confusion. Silas Brennan had been carried off to the town jail, his leg wound treated just enough to keep him alive for trial. Vernon Mills had sent men to retrieve Jedediah Craw from the tree where Caleb had left him. The wounded outlaw was now occupying the cell next to his former partner in crime. Vernon Mills had taken charge of the situation, organizing the remaining townspeople into something resembling order. He had sent riders to the territorial capital to request a federal marshal, understanding that crimes of this magnitude required authority beyond what Willow Creek could provide. But perhaps more importantly, he had begun the process of making amends. Throughout the day, townspeople came to the cabin in small groups. They came bearing gifts of food and supplies, offerings of apology for the 2 years of cruelty they had inflicted on an innocent woman and child. Some came with words rehearsed and formal. Others could barely speak through their shame. All of them left with the same message ringing in their ears. Margaret Holloway had forgiven them. It was not an easy forgiveness. It was not a forgiveness that erased the pain or forgot the suffering, but it was a choice, a deliberate decision to release the burden of hatred and move forward into a future unmarred by bitterness. I do not forgive you because you deserve it, Margaret told each visitor. I forgive you because carrying anger is too heavy a burden for me to bear any longer. My husband believed that every person deserved a second chance. He died for that belief. The least I can do is honor his memory by living it. Some of the townspeople wept at her words. Others simply nodded and retreated, unable to meet her eyes. But all of them left changed, carrying with them the seed of a lesson that would grow in the months and years to come. Kindness was not weakness. Forgiveness was not surrender. And the measure of a person was not found in their worst moments, but in their willingness to grow beyond them. 3 days after the confrontation, Dr. Patterson came to change Caleb's bandages and check on his progress. The old physician moved with a lightness that had been absent for years, as if the weight of his long-kept secret had finally been lifted from his shoulders. The wound is healing well, he announced after his examination. You are a lucky man, Mr. Thornton, or perhaps lucky is not the right word. Blessed, perhaps, watched over. I have had a lot of practice surviving, Caleb said dryly. It becomes a habit after a while. Patterson chuckled, then grew serious. I wanted to thank you for pushing me to do what I should have done 2 years ago, for giving me the chance to make things right. You did that yourself, Doc. All I did was remind you that you had the choice. The old man shook his head. It was more than that. I had convinced myself that staying silent was the only option, that speaking up would only bring more harm. But watching you risk your life to protect this family, it showed me what real courage looks like. It is not the absence of fear. It is acting despite the fear. Someone wise once told me the same thing. Caleb glanced at Clara, who was sitting on the floor playing with a small doll Margaret had bought from the peddler before everything had gone wrong. I think I will keep passing that wisdom along. Patterson stood to leave, then paused at the door. The federal marshal should arrive within the week. He will want statements from everyone involved. Are you prepared for that? We have been preparing for it my whole life, Caleb said, even when I did not know it. The marshal arrived 6 days later, a grizzled veteran named Thomas Whitfield, who had spent 3 decades bringing justice to the territories. He was a man of few words and keen observation. with eyes that seemed to see through lies the way sunlight cuts through fog. He spent 2 days interviewing everyone involved: Caleb and Margaret, Dr. Patterson, Vernon Mills, and other townspeople who had witnessed Silas Brennan's confession. Even little Clara, who told her story with the simple honesty of a child unaware of how powerful her testimony would prove. Jedediah Craw, faced with the mountain of evidence against him, finally broke. He confessed to everything: the cattle thefts and redemption that had nearly cost Caleb his life, the similar operations he had run with Silas Brennan in Willow Creek, the murder of Samuel Holloway carried out with poison slipped into his coffee on a night when Jed had crept back into town, despite everyone believing he was long gone. He even confessed to poisoning Clara, a desperate attempt to force Margaret into revealing the location of a treasure that had never existed. Samuel had spoken of his savings in Jed's presence, exaggerating perhaps to seem more prosperous than he was. Jed had spent 2 years convinced that a fortune was hidden somewhere on the Holloway property, and his greed had driven him to attempted murder of a child. Marshall Whitfield listened to it all with the patience of a man who had heard every excuse and justification the human mind could produce. When the confessions were complete and the evidence compiled, he rendered his verdict. Jedediah Craw and Silas Brennan would be transported to the territorial prison to await trial for murder, attempted murder, theft, and conspiracy. Given the weight of evidence against them, conviction was virtually certain. The punishment for murder in the Wyoming Territory was death by hanging. Justice would finally be served. 2 weeks after the marshal completed his investigation, the prisoners were transported. Margaret stood on the porch of her cabin and watched the wagon roll away down the road toward town. Caleb stood beside her, his arm in a sling, but his presence as solid and reassuring as ever. "It is over," she said softly. "After all this time, it is finally over." "The darkness is over," Caleb agreed. "But our story is just beginning." She turned to look at him, this man who had ridden into her life as a stranger and had become her everything. "What happens now? Now we build. We build a home. We build a family. We build a life together that no one can take from us." And the wedding. He smiled, that warm and gentle smile that made her heart flutter like a girl half her age. "I was thinking spring, when the wildflowers bloom and the creek runs clear. If that suits you, that suits me perfectly." She kissed him then, right there on the porch, in full view of anyone who might be watching. She did not care about propriety or appearances. She cared only about this moment, this man, this second chance at happiness that she had never expected to receive. Behind them, the door creaked open, and Clara poked her head out. "Mama, are you and Mr. Caleb kissing again?" Margaret laughed and held out her hand. "Come here, sweetheart." Clara bounded out onto the porch and inserted herself between them, her small arms wrapping around both adults. "Is it true what everyone is saying, that the bad men are going away forever?" "It is true," Caleb assured her. "They are going to face justice for what they did, and they cannot hurt us anymore. No one is going to hurt this family ever again. I promise." Clara considered this for a moment with the seriousness that only a child could muster. Then she nodded, satisfied. "Good, because I want to be a flower girl at the wedding. Martha Mills said she would help me make a dress with real ribbons." Margaret and Caleb exchanged a glance over her head, amusement and love mingling in equal measure. "Then a flower girl you shall be," Margaret said, "the prettiest flower girl in all of Wyoming Territory." Clara beamed and squeezed them both tighter. This is the best family ever. And standing there in the golden afternoon light, surrounded by the people who had become his whole world, Caleb Thornton silently agreed. Winter came to the valley of Willow Creek, blanketing the land in white and driving everyone indoors. But inside the Holloway cabin, warmth prevailed. Caleb's wound healed cleanly, leaving only a scar that Margaret traced sometimes with her fingers, a reminder of how close she had come to losing him. He regained his strength day by day, and soon he was back to work, preparing the property for the family they intended to build. He expanded the cabin, adding 2 rooms to accommodate future growth. He built a proper barn for Dusty and the cow that Vernon Mills had gifted them as part of his ongoing apology. He reinforced everything against the harsh Wyoming winters, determined that his family would never again suffer from cold or hunger. Margaret took up her garden again, planning for spring planting with an enthusiasm she had not felt in years. She reconnected with the women of the town, slowly rebuilding relationships that had been shattered by Silas Brennan's lies. Some friendships could not be salvaged, the wounds too deep, the trust too broken. But others proved more resilient than she had expected. Martha Mills became a particular friend, visiting the cabin regularly to help with sewing and to keep Margaret company during the long winter days. The older woman carried her own guilt about the years of silence, but Margaret's forgiveness had given her permission to move forward. "We should have stood up sooner," Martha said one afternoon as they worked on Clara's flower girl dress. "We knew in our hearts that something was wrong, but Silas was so powerful and we were so afraid." "Fear makes cowards of us all," Margaret replied. "The important thing is that when the moment came, you chose courage. That was your doing. Yours and Mr. Thornton's. You showed us that standing up for what is right is possible, even when it seems impossible." Margaret smiled and continued her stitching. "We showed you that it was necessary. The possibility was always there. You just needed someone to remind you." Clara bounced around the cabin, more energetic than ever, her brush with death having left no lasting effects on her spirit. She had embraced Caleb as her new father with the wholehearted acceptance that children excel at following him around the property and helping with chores that were far too advanced for her small hands. Caleb never complained. He taught her everything she wanted to learn, from how to saddle a horse to how to whittle simple shapes from wood. He read to her every night, doing voices for all the characters until she fell asleep with a smile on her face. He answered her endless questions with patience and love, treating each query as if it were the most important thing in the world. Because to him it was. This child had stolen his heart in a way he had never expected. She was not his blood, but she was his daughter in every way that mattered. And he would spend the rest of his life making sure she knew how much she was loved. As winter began to release its grip on the land, preparations for the wedding intensified. Reverend Ezra Whitmore, a kind old minister from the neighboring town of Ridgemont, who had refused to believe in curses or gossip, agreed to perform the ceremony. He arrived a week early to meet the couple and was immediately charmed by their obvious devotion to each other. "I have married many couples in my years of ministry," he told them over dinner, "but I have rarely seen a love as hard-won as yours. God brought you together through fire and trial, and you emerged stronger for it. That is a foundation that will last a lifetime. We intend for it to last longer than that," Caleb said, reaching across the table to take Margaret's hand. "If heaven will have us." The minister laughed. "I suspect heaven will be glad to have you both when the time comes. But let us not rush things. You have many good years ahead of you first." The wedding day dawned clear and beautiful, the kind of spring morning that seemed designed by Providence to celebrate new beginnings. Wildflowers carpeted the meadow beside the creek that ran behind the Holloway property, splashes of yellow and purple and white against the fresh green grass. The guest list had grown beyond anything Margaret had expected. Not just the townspeople of Willow Creek, many of whom had come seeking continued redemption through their presence, but families from surrounding areas who had heard the story of the cursed cabin and wanted to witness its happy ending. Clara served as flower girl just as she had demanded, scattering petals along the path with solemn concentration. Her dress, sewn with love by Margaret and Martha Mills, was white with blue ribbons that matched her mother's eyes. She took her role with the seriousness of a general planning a military campaign, determined that every petal should land in exactly the right place. Caleb stood at the end of the aisle, Vernon Mills beside him as best man. He wore a new suit purchased from a tailor in Ridgemont, the first new clothes he had owned in more than a decade. His hair was trimmed, his beard neatly shaped, and his boots polished to a shine that seemed at odds with his weathered hands. But it was his face that drew the most attention. The face of a man who had spent half his life searching for something he could not name and had finally found it in the most unexpected place. When Margaret appeared at the end of the aisle, Caleb felt the breath leave his body. She wore a simple white dress that Martha had helped her make, with lace at the collar and cuffs that had belonged to her grandmother. Her auburn hair was pinned up with wildflowers woven through it, and her face glowed with a happiness that transformed her from beautiful to radiant. She walked toward him on her own, having no father to give her away and wanting none. She had survived 2 years of isolation and cruelty on her own strength. She would come to her wedding the same way. When she reached him, Caleb took her hands in his, and the rest of the world fell away. Reverend Whitmore spoke the traditional words, but Caleb barely heard them. He was lost in Margaret's eyes and the promise of the future they represented, in the miracle of finding love in the midst of tragedy. When the time came for personal vows, Caleb spoke from his heart. I spent my whole life searching for something I could not name, riding from town to town, ranch to ranch, never staying long enough to put down roots. I thought I was happy. I thought freedom meant having no ties, no responsibilities, no one waiting for me at the end of the day. He paused, his voice thick with emotion. I was wrong. Freedom is not about being alone. Freedom is finding the people worth staying for. And I have found them. I have found you. Margaret's tears flowed freely now, but her smile was brighter than the sun. When I lost Samuel, she said, her voice steady despite the tears I thought my heart would never heal. I closed myself off from the world, convinced that love was a luxury I could no longer afford. I survived, but I did not live. She squeezed his hands tighter. Then you came, a stranger on a wounded horse looking for shelter. And instead of shelter, you found a home. You found us. And in finding us, you helped us find ourselves again. Reverend Whitmore smiled and spoke the final words. By the power vested in me by God, in the territory of Wyoming, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Mr. Thornton, you may kiss your bride. Caleb did not need to be told twice. Their first kiss as husband and wife was tender and sweet, a promise sealed before God and witnesses. Clara cheered from her position nearby, and Dusty whinnied from her spot beside the fence, as if adding her own blessing to the union. The assembled guests erupted in applause, their clapping echoing off the mountains that surrounded the valley. That evening, as the celebration continued around them, Caleb and Margaret slipped away to the porch of their cabin. The porch where they had shared so many conversations, so many dreams, so many moments of connection that had built the foundation of their love. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that seemed too beautiful to be real. In the distance, the sounds of laughter and music drifted from the celebration, but here on the porch, there was only peace. No one came near this cabin for 2 years, Margaret said softly, leaning her head against Caleb's shoulder. They were afraid of a curse that did not exist. And then you came along and changed in everything. I was just a lost cowboy looking for shelter, Caleb replied, kissing the top of her head. You were the one who invited me in. From inside the cabin, Clara's voice rang out. Mama, Papa, come see. There are so many stars. They turned to find their daughter pressed against the window, her face filled with wonder as she gazed up at the emerging night sky. The stars were indeed spectacular diamonds, scattered across velvet more than anyone could count in a lifetime. Caleb wrapped one arm around Margaret and held out his other hand to Clara. The little girl ran to them, and he lifted her up, settling her on his hip as Margaret leaned against his other side. The three of them stood there together, watching the stars emerge one by one, a family forged not by blood, but by choice, by love, by the stubborn refusal to let darkness win. This is home, Clara whispered contentedly, her small hand reaching up to touch Caleb's face. He caught her fingers and kissed them gently. Yes, it is, sweetheart, the only home I will ever need. 1 year later, the cabin at the edge of Willow Creek had transformed beyond recognition. The modest home that Caleb had first discovered, struggling against neglect and isolation, had grown into a proper homestead. A second floor had been added, providing room for the expanding family. A real barn stood where the old chicken coop had been housing Dusty, 2 cows and a new foal that Clara had named Starlight because of the white mark on his forehead. The garden had tripled in size, producing enough vegetables to feed the family and provide surplus for the weekly market in town. Margaret had become known for her preserves, which sold out within hours of being displayed. The money from these sales, combined with Caleb's work as a farrier and general handyman, had lifted the family from survival to genuine prosperity. But the greatest change was not visible from the outside. In a small cradle beside the bed that Caleb and Margaret shared, a baby boy slept peacefully. Samuel Thornton Jr. had been born 3 months ago, named in honor of the man whose death had set all of this in motion. He had his mother's auburn hair and his father's dark eyes, and according to Clara, he was the most perfect baby in the entire world. She spent hours watching over him, singing songs and telling stories, and generally being the most devoted big sister imaginable. When he cried, she was the first to respond. When he smiled, she claimed credit for making it happen. She had taken her role as protector and teacher with the same seriousness she brought to everything else. On this particular afternoon, 1 year to the day, since the wedding, the whole family sat together on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in familiar shades of beauty. Caleb held Samuel Jr. in the crook of his good arm, the baby making small, contented sounds as he drifted between sleep and waking. Margaret leaned against his other side, her eyes closed, a smile of pure contentment on her face. Clara sat at their feet, brushing Dusty's coat with the meticulous care she had learned from Caleb. The town of Willow Creek had changed in the years since Silas Brennan's arrest. His trial had been swift, his guilt undeniable. He and Jedediah Craw had both been sentenced to hang, and the sentences had been carried out 2 months ago in the territorial capital. Justice had been served, not through violence or vengeance, but through truth and the proper workings of law. Samuel Holloway's name had been cleared, his reputation restored, his legacy of kindness vindicated. The townspeople who had once shunned his widow now treated her with respect, bordering on reverence. They brought their horses to Caleb for shoeing, bought Margaret's preserves for their tables, invited Clara to play with their children. The curse that had never existed was finally and completely dead. Vernon Mills had become something of a leader in the community, using his influence to promote the values that Samuel Holloway had died for. Second chances, compassion, the belief that people could change and grow and become better than their worst moments. It was not a perfect town. No place was perfect. But it was a town that was trying, and that was more than most could say. I have been thinking, Margaret said, breaking the comfortable silence. That sounds dangerous. Caleb's voice was warm with teasing affection. She swatted his arm gently. I have been thinking about Samuel. Not my Samuel, though I think of him often. Our Samuel. She nodded toward the baby. I have been thinking about what kind of world we want him to grow up in. And what have you concluded? I want him to grow up in a world where kindness is valued, where people are judged by their actions, not their pasts, where second chances are given freely and forgiveness is seen as strength rather than weakness. That sounds like a world worth building. It is the world his grandfather tried to create. Margaret's voice grew soft. And it is the world we can create now in his memory. Caleb shifted Samuel Jr. to his other arm and reached out to take Margaret's hand. Then that is what we will do. We will build that world one day at a time. For Samuel, for Clara, for this little one, and for all the families who will come after us. Clara looked up from her, brushing her face serious. Can I help build it too? Of course you can. Margaret smiled at her daughter. Building a better world is not something grown-ups do alone. It takes everyone working together, being kind to each other, standing up for what is right. Like Papa stood up for us, exactly like that. Clara nodded solemnly, then returned to her brushing with renewed determination. Caleb watched her, this child who had survived poisoning and isolation and the cruelty of fearful people, and he felt something swell in his chest that might have been pride or hope or simply love. She was going to be all right. They were all going to be all right. The sun dipped below the horizon and the first stars began to emerge. In the distance, a coyote howled and an owl called from somewhere in the forest. The sounds of the wilderness that had once seemed threatening now felt like the voice of home. I never thought I would have this, Caleb said quietly. A family, a home, a place where I belong. For so many years, I convinced myself that I did not want these things, that freedom meant solitude, that safety meant distance, and now I understand what I was searching for all those years. Not escape, not solitude, but belonging. A place where my presence matters. People who need me as much as I need them. Margaret lifted her head and kissed his cheek. You are a wise man, Caleb Thornton. I am a lucky man, and getting luckier every day. Samuel Jr. chose that moment to wake fully, letting out a cry that demanded immediate attention. Claire immediately abandoned her brushing and rushed over her small face, earnest with concern. I can help Papa. I know how to make him stop crying. Then show me, sweetheart. Clara leaned in and began singing softly a lullaby that Margaret had sung to her when she was small. Her voice was not perfect, but it was filled with love, and that was enough. The baby's cries subsided, replaced by the small sounds of contentment. See, Clara beamed with pride. I told you I could do it. You are the best big sister in the world, Caleb told her, and meant every word. The stars continued to emerge, filling the sky with light. The family stayed on the porch long after the sun had set, wrapped in blankets against the cool evening air, talking and laughing and simply being together. There would be challenges ahead. Life on the frontier was never easy, and the world had a way of testing even the strongest families. but they would face those challenges together, drawing strength from each other, from the love they had built, from the foundation of trust and sacrifice that had brought them this far. The cabin that had been called cursed was now a home. The woman who had been shunned was now surrounded by community. The cowboy who had been lost was now exactly where he belonged. And as night fell over the valley of Willow Creek, a new chapter continued to unfold. Not a chapter of curses or loneliness or fear, but a chapter of love, hope, and the kind of happiness that comes from finding home in the most unexpected places. Caleb Thornton had ridden into this valley seeking shelter for a wounded horse. What he had found was infinitely more precious. He had found a family. He had found redemption. He had found the home that his heart had been searching for all along. And that was the greatest gift of all. In the years to come, the story of the cursed cabin would become a legend in Willow Creek and the surrounding territory. People would tell it around campfires and in general stores, passing it from generation to generation. They would speak of Samuel Holloway, the blacksmith, with a heart of gold, who believed in second chances and paid for that belief with his life. They would speak of Margaret, his widow, who endured 2 years of isolation and cruelty without ever losing her faith or her dignity. They would speak of Caleb Thornton, the wandering cowboy who arrived at the darkest moment and brought light back to a family that had almost lost hope. And they would speak of Clara, the little girl who grew up to be a woman of remarkable courage and compassion, who carried her father's legacy of kindness forward and taught it to her own children in turn. But those who knew the family best, who visited the cabin and shared meals at their table, knew that the legend was only part of the story. The real story was quieter. It was morning coffee on the porch, watching the sun rise over the mountains. It was Clara's laughter as she chased the chickens around the yard. It was Samuel Jr., his first steps and later his first words spoken with his sister's patient coaching. It was the touch of hands across a dinner table, the comfort of shared silence, the million small moments that add up to a life well lived. It was love in all its ordinary and extraordinary forms. And that story continued long after the legend had been told, and retold long after the participants had passed into memory, long after the cabin itself had crumbled and been rebuilt and crumbled again. Because love, the Thornton family had learned, was not a destination. It was a journey, and theirs had only just begun.